Welcome drifters. Today we'll be doing another build. This time I'm starting out in draft mode for a pure HYPERbreaker build. So right off the start I'm going to be looking for hull mods. Obviously we will try to skip reloads as much as possible. I'll pause right here so you can quickly see which mods I'm taking. Pretty much the mods I'm taking right now are the ones to prioritize in the beginning of the run. So because of this is an Ataraxia build, the new Ataraxia. If you don't know, the new Ataraxia makes it so if you have at least 20 stacks, you got a permanent hyper boost, which obviously is great in of itself, but for the HYPERbreaker it's just perfect. So the hyper boost was changed in the last patch as well, so some of the stats it provides are reduced, but regardless of this it's still a hyper boost and still is very potent. So it roughly gives 33% increase to thrust, regeneration and fire rate, if I'm not mistaken. And besides it makes this cool looking visual effects as well. So that's that. Now let's continue with the overview of the build. So as you can see, this is a rapid reconstruction build, so you will have no shield. Later on you'll get hidden power as well, so no weapon. So it's purely a crush build. That's what the HYPERbreaker is made for. And to deal with the area effect and the smaller enemies, I'll be utilizing some form of area effect burn damage in the beginning. This is the celestial ones, but later on we'll definitely need corrosion, especially coupled with dying star. Now this is very good with dying star as well, because the extra regen because of the hyper boost. Now without out of the way, let's see what are the core mods that we'll need to take. So as you start, as you know, in draft mode you've got a limited amount of mods that you can utilize right off from the start. Ataraxia is very powerful to utilize right from the beginning, and this is more easy to set up in draft mode than it is in a regular run. So I've decided to start off with Ataraxia first. That means I'll need to have 20 points stacked. That doesn't leave a lot of room for other starting mods. So I found out for this bit specifically, the most important mods you want to look out right from the beginning, before you start level up, so you can get it going. First off, you need to focus on getting the celestial ones. The celestial ones is required for the area effect damage that you are able to take smaller enemies just like this. Otherwise it gets very annoying when you can't hit them. Strafe is always necessary on the HYPERbreaker, but it's not required that early yet. However, stabilization, I would always aim to at least get stabilization at the beginning. The third important mod to look for is a rapid reconstruction, obviously. The sooner you get it, the better sustain you have for the celestial ones. So I tried to establish it right from the get-go. Another important one is absorption, which is great especially on enemies like this one, but it's not as necessary. However, I always try to get it as soon as possible. I've also taken force armor here, as you can see, which wasn't necessary, but still helps with the area a little bit. I've also taken bravado. So bravado is pretty much needed for this build. One of the reasons is because it's very powerful, so you can get a nice high score. But the other reason is it increases both your unique body powers, which makes you deal much more damage against single targets, which helps in one-shotting the most threatening enemies. And the other is it increases your base stats, which is the thrust, which increases further the your crash damage, increases your total hull, which increases the total regenerations. And pretty much these are the core mods I try to look for. If you can find Skirmish, that's also a great one to get early on, so you can one-shot enemies more easily. And the next thing I'll be looking for the most is corrosion and strafe. So there it is. Corrosion helps spread the fire damage from celestial ones, which in turn helps to deal with mines that are left over, like lots of projectiles on the screen, which can be sometimes overwhelming in the early game. As you can see, I wasn't able to one-shot this juggernaut as easily because I still haven't taken the thrust mode. Once you got the thrust mode and strafe, you can pretty much one-shot everything, even seraphs, if you got a decent start on them. Now let's see about Ataraxia. So the new Ataraxia have different things added to it and some things removed. First off, the orb attraction power, which increases the strength of the attraction of experienced orbs, has been removed from Ataraxia and is now part of the final stand mode, so you don't get that benefit from it. However, on top of the old stacking benefits, we now got 3 new parts to the Ataraxia mode. Once you got to a certain threshold, you unlock new powers. So basically, at 20 stacks of Ataraxia, you've got a permanent hyper boost, and you've got about 45% increase to your unique body powers, which is extremely good on the HYPERbreaker because it increases both the innate HYPERbreaker recovery and, most importantly, it increases its overall single target crash damage input, which is dependent on how fast you're traveling. Same goes for bravado and evolutionary niches. On top, having so many stacks will innately increase your total hull and global damage by a lot, which is for the HYPERbreaker. Don't forget that at the end of the run I'll have the usual cheat sheet, the cheat sheet tool link with the build, as well as the image file with the mods that I'm using in the whole build. I also have links to our Discord, where I usually post all the files as well. So the core mods, most of them I've already explained. The aim is to get Dying Star later on, Strafe. I've also gotten Force Armor, which is overall good, provides some extra area as well. We'll need Core Shielding for the Dying Star later on. And pretty much you only need a few mods to get this build going. The late game struggles are the big waves with multiple enemies. Boss enemies are not that big of a problem. The hive enemies, like you can see, this population can get out of hand pretty quickly, so you have to focus down the elite hives and take them out with priority. Now with Strafe I can take both these in one hit, but here I decided to let the Cyan finish it. Now another very important mod that you're going to need in the late game is Phantom Strike, because it increases the crash damage by 25%, which is a very big increase. And this is pretty much the only mod that you're not guaranteed to get. But you got a lot of rerolls, so at some point you should be able to find it. So the two mods that directly increase the crash damage are Skirmish and Phantom Strike. So let me go a little bit in depth with the Skirmish now. So first of all, the Skirmish mod increases your crash damage in general, but an often neglected part of Skirmish is the other half of the mod, which gives you 50% extra crash damage after you fire your weapon and 50% extra weapon damage after you've crashed. We don't care about the weapon damage, but the crash damage. So after you acquire hidden power, this effect is lost because you can no longer fire your weapon, but you got a permanent 40% extra global damage, which is basically the Skirmish effect all the time. So before you get to hidden power, because sometimes it can take you a while, what I usually do is before I hit a big enemy, I tap the fire button so it fires one or two projectiles, then the Skirmish effect triggers and the next target you hit takes 50% extra crash damage. So once you hit the target, you repeat, fire again quickly, and then the next target takes 50% extra. So I utilize this technique all the time before I acquire hidden power. It's only because I've got hidden power that early, I wasn't able to utilize it that much, so I'm able to showcase, but this is how I usually do it. Now I've just taken triple rampage with Revelation. You can always take Defiance instead of Rampages. On some runs I prefer Defiance, on some runs I prefer Rampage. Ideally you get 3 or 4 Rampages with Revelation or Exponential Growth, and with the other you take Defiance. I find it better to get 3 Rampages with Revelation and 4 Defiances with, what was it, Exponential Growth. Evolutionary Niches are the third best choice for wild mode afterwards, and I wouldn't take those instead of the other two mods with Revelation or Exponential Bond. That brings me to another point, which is Obsession. Obsession can actually work pretty well with this build, especially if you're able to stack Defiances. So first of all, Defiance has now been changed and is no longer a rare mode, so it's much more easily acquired. Having to keep 20 levels locked though means you got very little room for improvisation, and the only way I see it viable to pick Defiances, Evolutionary Niches or Rampages is through Obsession, Revelation or Exponential Growth. Now I'll talk about Terminate and Blitz, both corresponding mods after Skirmish. So Terminate, there is no downside to it really, besides taking down bosses even quicker. Basically, Terminate makes it so it's more easier to one-shot big enemies. So I always get it. Blitz, however, first of all, Blitz has been changed now, so you can trigger it on any enemy that's 95% or more health. That means burn mods, corrosion or dying star won't instantly make it so that you can't trigger Blitz on them, which in turn increases your ability to one-shot boss enemies. Once you start getting corrosion plus dying star, however, enemies quickly fall below 95% health, at least the smaller enemies, so you can't trigger Blitz on them. However, on bosses, perfect, you can still one-shot them with these. So both of those mods coupled, Blitz and Terminate, essentially reduce the enemy health that much more, so that it's viable to one-shot bosses even in the very late game. The only problem is once you start getting enough fire damage for the small enemies. So that's why I put Terminate as a core mode, but Blitz only as an extension. The missiles the Juggernauts deploy at especially faster rate the longer the game goes become very deadly, because you can't properly hit the Juggernaut to one-shot it, and it gets very tricky in the late game. So that's why you need Dying Star, because it gets rid of those pretty easily. You get that sort of wave with the two snakes and the elite snappers pretty often actually in the late game, so Purification is very good for it. The reason for that is because Purification provides extra recovery for each burning segment, and because snappers and the snakes have lots of segments, you gain a very nice boost to your recovery for the moment. But even so, Purification is considered as a very late game luxury extension to this build. As I already mentioned, because the build requires you to sacrifice 280 levels for the Ataraxia. That means you have to be very selective of the builds you get as an extension. And this is my list for the extension mode. So as I already discussed, Purification. The other one is Blitz. The other one is Streamline, because it would help you spread corrosion a bit more easily in the late game, help you deal with some further away mines and such stuff, but it's not really necessary to get going. I tried experimenting with it in the early game a couple of times. It does really help in the early game when you don't have that much area, but the Celestial ones just works better overall in the early game, and the Celestial ones is viable all the time, whereas with Streamline I feel like it loses its viability in the late game as opposed to the Celestial ones. It's not that it's not viable, it doesn't help, because it really does, but you just have to be very selective of the core mods. So that's why Streamline goes to the extension modes. Next one is Purge. What Purge will really do for this build is on some occasions help you deal more damage against single enemies. For example, some enemies that you're not able to one-shot completely will be getting a lot of corrosion stacks because of the dying star. So upon your second or third hit on them, you apply the Purge, which pretty much guarantee will one-shot them, or I mean you won't one-shot them but will end them finally, because it's very niche and it's really helpful on some very specific occasions. That's why it goes as an extension as well. What else? Efficiency. I would consider usually efficiency as a core mod for this, because 20% extra regen on top of rapid reconstruction, on top of the big hull and the hyper boost is actually very powerful. It's only put as an extension because of the scarcity of the levels we've got. Next, the hyper metabolism. I just picked one here. I think maybe you can get away with two. I'm not convinced you get that much more benefit out of with two, but I haven't really experimented that much to be able to say conveniently, but I can with confidence say that one hyper metabolism makes this build much better, because as you know, the hyper metabolism increases your regen at the cost of 50% of your max health being reserved. It's even better now actually, because I forgot the hyper metabolism got buffed, so now it gives 60% extra recovery or regen instead of just 45 from before. So actually 2 might be really viable. That's about all the extension mods. The usual wild mods apply, as already discussed. Rampage, Hyper Metabolism 1, Defiances, and Evolutionary Niches. I wouldn't go more than 3 rampages though, or 4 maximum, because then the stabilize effect doesn't really slow you enough to be able to dodge projectiles with precision. Okay, here I'm about to take Rebuke. Rebuke will first of all increase the power of channeling and core armor by a lot. It actually makes all of the stacks, the armor stacks, last twice as long, which is extremely good. But this coupled with the celestial ones, and especially with Dying Star later on, means that you can spam the Rebuke projectiles a lot. Now, admittedly, they are pretty shit, because their targeting is shit, and like, in general they're not that good. But there are some situations that I find good use out of them. You just have to use them a lot to get a good sense of what they're able to hit and what they won't really make. Basically, as you can see, they've got some targeting, but they don't turn that well enough. That's first thing you have to have in mind. And second is, they're very good at hunting targets that are not very mobile. So you have to wait for opportunities when targets are not moving that much and then release the Rebuke projectiles. Now once you get Dying Star, it becomes a different story, because once you fire the projectiles, you can get back full stacks almost immediately. So that means you can spam. And as usual, you have to be mindful of not over spamming those, because when you just spam, you do lose the armor stacks. So when you're about to get big hits, or when you just are going in for a crash, it doesn't make sense to release. I usually go in for a big hit, and once I'm out on the other side, if there are some leftover enemies that may need to be cleared and I don't have enough time to go back to them, I spam the Rebuke. I'm not sure if Rebuke applies corrosion, because if the projectiles actually apply corrosion, that means they're actually very good for this build. I played as if they do. Even if they didn't, I felt like it helped, so that's that. Another impossible choice. Core shielding versus purification, and what was the other thing I wanted? Yeah, channeling. Channeling is very important for the build. Increase your regeneration a lot, especially post Dying Star acquisition. Now let's talk about deflagration. So no deflagnate this time, and I'll explain why. First of all, deflagration requires to invest 3 points to get rupture, and then another point to get deflagration itself, which are 4 extra mods. And admittedly, you could leave out all the extension mods like Blitz, Streamline, Purge, Purification. All of those can be skipped, which are 4, to get deflagration. And in some cases I did. Maybe it was luck, maybe I was just getting bad waves, but I couldn't make it past wave 500 really when I got deflagration, and I did almost at least, it must have been at least 20 runs where I got past 2A500, and I think I even got to 600 with one of the runs. None of them actually had Deflagration, and it really felt like during the run the Deflagration is very beneficial. Maybe it was like I can't tell for sure, but it seems like on paper Deflagration is better. Gameplay wise, it feels like it makes things easier, but the actual results showed that I wasn't able to gain as a better score as without it. So I still recommend it. Maybe in best case scenario you get Deflagration, right in the late game you get Quantum Decoherence, and from it you're able to get some of the extension mods, and that's the best case scenario. Another interesting point about Deflagration is that once you take Hidden Power, Rupture no longer works. So once you got Hidden Power, the Rupture effect is lost, and the only thing that triggers is the Deflagration effect. And although this build has a good area effect burn damage coverage, it doesn't really have a strong burn damage source, like a big burn damage number, which makes the Deflagration effect very weak damage wise, but very strong to spread around, which is basically an upgrade to Corrosion. You basically get an upgrade to Corrosion for 4 extra points, and you lose the Rupture effect. And mind, the Rupture damage scales with enemy health, which they do scale the longer the game goes. So the Rupture becomes more and more powerful the longer the game is, but you lose it once you get Hidden Power, so it's a bit so-so. But to summarize, I do think in best case scenario, in perfect run, you would get Deflagration, in the end you get Quantum Decoherence, and from it you get as many of the extension mods as possible. Besides RNG, one of the problems with that is that the whole Rupture tree really doesn't help you in the early game, and you basically sacrifice a lot of your potential in the early game, which in turn makes you lose more runs before you get to the actual late game. So like this way, for example, is a good time to use and practice the Rebuke projectiles if you don't want to trigger all the mines at the same time. Sometimes you can release your Rebuke projectiles just moments before the new wave hits. So they just fly around in the air, and because later on the enemies move around and slam at you at so high speeds that sometimes you can get lucky and the wave can actually hit itself into the Rebuke projectiles, which is not that big of a deal, but every small thing adds up in the end. So what other cool builds can we make out of the new Ataraxia, having the hyper boost stacked all the time? Similar builds to this, I've tried the Leviathan, which holds up pretty nicely, but is very easily overwhelmed in the late game, because you just can't dodge so well. The Firefly is a very cool alternative to this one. You sacrifice your crushing power, but instead you can make a good use of the new Celestial Surge. Actually, by new I mean the buffed one. If you don't know, in this patch the Celestial Surge has had, I think, plus 50% increase to its damage, so that should work very well. I think you'll struggle more against Seraphs for sure, but maybe the Juggernauts won't be so hard. Anyway, I'm curious, let me know your suggestions for any future video as usual, but I'm really interested in utilizing the new Ataraxia. So in the end, here I picked Purification over all the other things I could have, solely because Purification could add some extra survivability in certain situations, and at this point survivability is your greatest issue. You won't get that much extra damage to deal with the big enemy health scaling, but some extra survivability is good. For example, this wave with all the shredder mines, so many shredder mines trigger the purification quite nicely, so you get a nice boost to your recovery. The juggernauts can be a good example for this as well. So if you're not able to immediately take them out, the missiles, because they can be destroyed, they get ignited, all the missiles get ignited, so you can get a nice boost to survivability during these brief moments. So thanks for watching, and in the next few moments you'll see the full build, and afterwards you can find all the relevant links in the description.